there it goes.
That's nice.
All right, looks like we are live on YouTube. This is the January 11th, 2022 meeting of the Node.js Loaders team.
Yeah.
All right, so I guess, Mail, do you want to
Sure.
tell us?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the get file system hook. So I implemented a prototype, and I like to get an idea of what's the next step. From what I understood, the main issue right now is to explain how it's different from the resolve hook coupled with the load hook. So basically, the main issue is that all the node resolution algorithm are made to work on the file directly on the file system. They made various file system calls. So if we don't have a get file system that exposes a virtual file system, then everything that we do on resolve will not be will not follow the same code path for the rest of the node resolution algorithm, and so they will have different results. So for instance, each time Node will make, let's say, a stat call to check whether something is a directory or not, resolve will not be able to do anything about that. When Node will try to read a package.json file in order to know what is the export field, resolve will not be able to help with that. So the get file system has a different use case than resolve plus load. And even though resolve plus load can be used for some simple usage where you're building some virtual file for one specific file, it's not viable once you start to get to the use case where you want to basically emulate a folder on the disk.
Now, it sounds to me like you're almost trying to do like mocking, like, right? Like you want to, like imagine like we're in like Jest or some other type of like unit testing environment, and you wanted to, like say you have a command line utility that like, I don't know, opens a text file and writes another line to it and saves it. Okay, something trivial. And you want to you want to write a test for this program. And so you don't want it actually interacting with the file system. So you want to mock all these, the read file and write file calls. Would that be like the kind of use case you have in mind?
Kinda, except that in my case, so you mentioned writing to the file system. In my case, I need to basically mock what's inside Node itself. So it's not exactly the same thing. I would not be able to leverage the same API for mocking as I would for the loaders. Does that make sense?
Why?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by like inside Node itself.
So
You mean like loaded modules?
For example, inside the node resolution algorithm, you are making various stat calls in order to check whether something is a directory or not, to check whether a file exists or not, to read JSON file. All those calls are made directly within the node source code. Yep. If we don't have a way to specify the logic that Node needs to use when making those calls, then it will always query the file system. So if what we are, if the virtual files are not on the actual file system, all those calls will fail.
Right, but if you implement a loader, like a full loader where you implement resolve and load, then I would think that all of the whole code path you're talking about that has these fs stat calls, etc., would be bypassed, or it should be. If it's not, then we have a bug.
No, it cannot, because that's the other problem with composition. You need different loaders to interact with each other without having to be aware of the others. So if Jan was to just tell this package is at this location, then it cannot just override the whole resolution. It just needs to replace some very specific parts of the resolution, and then let the rest of the resolution go as usual.
Well, like
And
what I'm
that's
I mean,
thinking
I
is,
don't. Go ahead, Jacob.
what I'm thinking is, I think like 20 minutes ago, I linked you a test in the repository in Node currently that deals with virtual files. So like none of those things exist. So
Yes.
what I'm thinking is if you were able to do that and just have yarn, say, in front, then it can just tell, you don't have to engage Node's default stuff. It can just say like, forget about that. Here, use this.
But I need to. That's not that is
Why?
doing all
You
the
need
access
to.
to the package.json.
Well,
That's not me.
I don't
don't
think
want
you
to do
need to.
this.
Is what I'm getting at, and I think that there's a lot of other
So we
side
pro-
effects if you like you want to just like change how Node say finds the controlling package.json for a particular file in Resolve. So it's like you want to override a tiny piece of
So we
Resolve.
don't do that in Resolve. You can't intercept package JSONs.
My goal is not to change
Oh.
how Node is finding the package.json. I just want to tell it whether a file exists or not.
That's not your ultimate goal though. Your ultimate goal is to like implement yarn plug and play, right? Like what's the real use case? Okay. So like this should be like before we build out a whole other UI or a whole other set of hooks, like we have to see why it's not possible in the current one. Because if there's two ways to override loading files, then that's a problem because like then we can't make that composable. So like the existing design that we have now, like if you look at that example I sent you of like if you go to the loaders repo and you click on design and you click on the middleware design, or even if you don't go into the chaining part, like you could just assume that yarn's the only loader for now at least. It like all the examples show like a specifier of like one of the examples is like HTTPS where Node would just choke if that specifier ever, until this new PR lands, Node would error on an HTTPS specifier, but that works in the current loader design, and that's been like the example in the docs for over a year. There's no reason that couldn't apply to just like everything. Like you want to apply to all specifiers because you want to load everything essentially from memory instead of from disk. But that should be possible today. You just have to like write a hook that can handle everything.
They have different semantics. I don't think that Resolve and the file system hooks or anything similar. Resolve is about the resolution. The file system hooks are not about the resolution itself. They are to tell Node what is the environment it works in. So they are used at the same time because they are related when you're
right,
doing
but you essentially want an alternate ESM loader that never hits the file system. Like you want an alternate, let me build this another way. If you were to build this by forking Node, you would fork Node and edit the ESM loader and replace all these like file system calls with other code that calls that reads something from memory or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like that could be one way to build plug and play. The intent of the loader hooks is this, like if you implement both resolve and load, you have overridden the entire ESM loader. Now you're responsible for handling all the complexity that it handles. But like if you were to say fork the entire ESM loader and put all of that logic inside resolve and load, you should be able to achieve the same end result. Like you could implement plug and play that way.
But that doesn't go in line with the idea of composability. If we are replacing everything, then we are replacing everything. It means that the other loaders don't have a chance to do anything else. So if you're using plug and play with TS node, it will not work because TS node will not have a chance to do anything because yarn will already be replacing the resolution. So it needs to have something where yarn can do some processing, then pass that to the other resolver, which can then do their own processing as they want. With the current resolve hook,
can.
how?
I think it can do that because as long as you're not hitting any of the default things, then Node is not going to do anything. All it's going to do is orchestrate these the loaders and the hooks interacting with each other. So let's say, I don't know, you've got yarn and TS node or whatever. Yarn does something and it provides virtual information and passes that along to whoever else, TS node or whatever. TS node says, cool, I believe you, and it uses it. And it itself doesn't make any FS calls or anything like that.
But
Then
for example, let's take a case where plug and play is running. Then right after you have TS node that runs and that adds the .ts extension automatically. In this case, then you will have yarn that will take the bare identifier, will resolve it so that you have the path, virtual path, and then it will send that to TS node. How does TS node check whether this file exists with the .ts extension in order to return it? It will need to query the file system. So either it will go through Node, which is probably the best option. That's what we did discuss with file system hooks, or it will need to use the FS module. But the FS module is not aware of those special logic. Does that make sense?
does yarn know that does yarn know what the file is, like what's in it or something?
Yes, that's what it would implement inside the get file system hook. So all the other loaders, which would use those hooks as well in order to make their own FS calls, would be able to just get the right result from yarn without having to be aware that they are operating within a plug and play context.
So what I'm thinking is, if the resolve hook says this is like where the thing is and what its format is, and then the load hook says, here's the stuff, like here's the source, and here's authoritatively what its format is. If the yarn hook is before the others, it can return a source, and however it gets that source, nobody cares. So you could hard code the source value into your yarn loader and always return hello world. And then
I'm not sure I see. Right now, in my example, we are even before load is even running. We are still in the resolution. Yarn just resolved the bare identifier to a folder, but leaves the rest of the path untransformed because it doesn't know what extension to add. So let's say that you have a foo/index. It will return /path/2/foo/index. And it will pass that forward to TS node. Then TS node will have this string. And it will need to know whether there is a /path/2/foo/index.ts on the file system. So how will it do that? Because if this file doesn't exist, then it needs to pass it along, and maybe another loader later will add another extension.
I mean, the easiest way to work around this, I'm personally in favor of file system hooks rather than this, is you can just call the other loaders .load during your resolve. There have been multiple use cases for this that we've talked about in the past. So,
like you'd have a map of the other ones, or you have your
just get an indirect
hook
reference to your next loader. There's no reason not to be allowed to call your next loader.
Okay.
Whatever the hook is. So there's no like security concern or anything like that. So
Yeah, that
if
could work.
TS node
And-
wanted to check if something exists, it would just call like yarn loaders dot load hook with the proper URL. And it would see an error if it doesn't exist, and it could try multiple at once if it wanted.
That, but then
think that-
TS node would need to know that yarn is involved.
No, because it wouldn't actually get yarn loader. It would just be like parent loader, whatever we call it, dot load.
One
Well,
problem with
it would be
that,
next in the middleware version.
Yeah,
I think that what Mael is saying is that like it's part of resolution because like TS node is trying to implement like CommonJS style resolution where it's like /file. So TS node is like, well, is there a file.ts? Okay, no. Is there a file.js? No, is and so as it's like running through the file system to try to figure out what the file name is to then like it needs to do that first to then figure out what the file is to try to load.
sure. I mean,
But
it doesn't.
and that's what he's saying.
do-
It's like he wants yarn to be able to intercept that. Like, does file.ts exist? And yarn would like, return that or say yes, and then the load
Yeah.
could happen.
I'm saying
There
you
is
can
some-
do it with load. You don't have to wait for a load lifecycle. You could just call next load function and get it.
Oh, from within the resolve hook?
Yeah, I've talked about this multiple times. Like,
but
there's all sorts of nice
there's another
things.
problem, which is that in a get file system, we need to have some primitives that are faster than just load. For instance, if you want to check whether a file exists or not, you don't need to load it. That's something that has been raised before, which is that some primitives like I think it's stat and read.json are currently using a specific native function in order to be fast.
Yep, but they always end up reading if they get to that point, so.
I guess
Eventually they call the read.
my concern is
Okay.
that like you're now like if we supply file system hooks, then we kind of break composability in a different way. Like, yes, it makes composability, it adds the composability that TS node, like you have a way to like mock how TS node works and like supply your own answers for stat calls. But because you're also mocking like read file or replacing read file, now it's like this and load are doing the same thing. So it's like,
Not exactly. I
They
mean,
are not doing
load,
the same. Load is calling read file, but there are two different levels with two different
Yeah.
semantics.
so load actually has transform involved these days. So it's no longer like a thing. When you complete load, you're expected to try to coerce it properly to something. So transpilation steps and stuff do occur. So like TS node, if you called it, you wouldn't actually see the contents on disk. You would actually go and get the resulting JavaScript after it compiles it.
right. But I'm just saying like right now it's a clear story for like setting up a chain of loaders that, do transformations. Like you could have TS node and then Babel after that or something like that, right? And they would just both be load hooks and it would be clear how to chain them. But you could also like implement TS node by just using the file system hooks. And like when a request for file.ts happens, TS node intercepts it and returns it as JavaScript. And now it's like, like the load
Like
chaining is like
responsibility is blurred.
I think
Right.
it's
That's
It's a matter of
fine.
documentation, and it could be clearly documented that transformation are meant to go inside the loader hook, whereas file creation, virtual layers are meant to go inside the get file system hook, and or low-level primitives that should rarely be used by transformers.
Yeah, so one thing that's pretty important to note here is even if you tried to do that, like various parts would break.
So I tried to do
data
which?
URLs, HTTP, like you literally just can't support them with that. And you could be like, if you try to do this with files, it's not going to work because there are modules that are not file based. And so like, even if somebody were to write a transform of your file system, so it's something else. So like TS Node was written with file system hooks. There's no good reason to do it. You still have to have a module loader to deal with import meta URL and things like that. Like you just don't have
So in other words,
enough
you're saying I
functionality.
shouldn't worry about it.
I'm saying like people will do it and then they'll be like, I need more functionality, and they'll use the proper API. That's it. They do overlap in some ways. That's inevitable because loaders do use files. Like we call out to a file system right now. So there's some overlap. There's delegation going on. And like trying to prevent any overlap is difficult. Preventing problematic overlap, I'm all for. But I don't see like overlap where it's like, you should never ever have virtual files because this. Like we're talking about allowing virtual files via the load hook. And like that's complicated because the load hook is actually like trying to return executable stuff, not the source text of a file. So if you have a tool that's like trying to get, I don't know, line information to show where an error is, it's going to be lost in your load hook. You got to start putting source maps in there just to act like that. And we don't have a hook for when we read package JSON. Like resolve doesn't expose it right now. We could have some utility functions that you recreate all of Node's loader with, but then you're having composition problems like Miles pointing out. I think it's just the loader hooks do a lot right now, and trying to make them do everything is going to be pushing it. There are workarounds that solve a number of use cases, but those workarounds are just like using the file system to try to rewrite a loader. Like it's not what they're designed for. It's not what they're good at.
Okay, so you think that that having file system hooks is the best solution?
I think it's an unfortunate truth that we're going to have to design stuff around. I don't think we're going to have like a solution for all the use cases that we see in different things. It's not just Yarn that does this. Like Lambda does this, and they don't talk about it. AWS is doing this the whole time.
Electron
Like,
is doing this.
What?
Electron is doing this.
Well, I mean, I was
Yeah.
thinking like you could do it. Everyone is doing it when they're using something like Docker, in that like you're virtualizing the file system, but outside of the node process. Like there's always that possibility of like, you don't have to mock within node to, you know.
Spinning up a Docker container just to run like a simple script is big.
Yeah,
Well, I'm just saying though, like that is another solution. Like
Yeah.
maybe there are more lightweight versions of this than Docker, but like you don't have to virtualize the file system within Node. You could virtualize it on the outside.
So
I mean,
we've already been doing that inside
Yeah.
Yarn for
That's-
years, and it
That's
works
already
fine.
there.
And people
Yeah, I'm
want
not
that.
suggesting you should. I'm just saying it's another option.
But
All right. I
we
think
go ahead. I think we're done.
I was gonna say, I think basically it's what I wrote on the PR is that like, I don't want to land this PR just as is. Like, I think we need a design doc that's with the rest of the loaders design docs that explains what the intended API is, some examples of how to use it. And then, and one of the examples should be Yarn plug and play, but also like something simple, like whatever the simplest hello world you can think of is. Ideally something that's not also already achievable using resolve and load. And then we can start iterating on that. And I'd say like, let's get that nailed down before we try to implement any PRs. I'd also like to get chaining finished before we add this, because I feel like that's important to get that working and out there. And then we layer this on and make sure that we don't break chaining load, because that'll be the challenge of like, that's the ultimately the challenge with this is how do we deal with the intermixed composability of load and like read file, right? So if we can get chained load first, then that'll already be like there as a basis for when we add this on top of it. Does that make sense?
I can make a pass on the design doc, and I don't need to land it soon, so that will be fine by me.
Okay, and maybe the design is, you know, exactly what you have in the PR. I mean, I'm assuming that's probably what your first pass of the design doc will be, is just describing what's in the PR. But I also think that like having some examples, like as intended for users to use, like look at the middleware design doc in the loaders repo. It's basically a series of examples that loader authors might write to use this API. I would find that really helpful to know where the corners are in these new hooks.
Sounds good.
Cool.
And something else is like, would these hooks apply to CommonJS too?
That's something that I'd like to propose later. But for now, I think loaders don't apply to CommonJS, right?
My child was sick for a few weeks, but I was planning to finish it over Christmas break. We have everything we need to move them off thread, then they can intercept CommonJS fine. Babel just did their move off thread as well. So
is it good in terms of performances?
It's no loss in performance, so it's pretty much only a gain in capability. No gain in performance, but for Babel, that's because they block during the whole thing. So they can't get any CPU gain. So for CommonJS, it's going to be a similar story. You're going to have to block the main thread while the hooks go on. For ESM, you don't have to block the main thread while you do it. So in theory, you could see some savings with dynamic import. Static import, you're not going to see savings.
But at least then it's all using the same thing.
Yeah, it'll be, their performance is the same. Astro just built a thing that could make performance better on a worker, even if we just block the main thread because they have a shared hash map structure. But it would mean that loaders couldn't use global state reliably, because any given loader, at least in Astro's design, can have two instances running at the same time with two different globals. So anything you put on the global has to be basically a cache. You can't actually save data on your global.
Okay.
But Astro saw 60% perf gain when they did it.
Ooh, nice.
So It's all about what you're willing to do. I don't think we'll do what Astra did because you would need to write very custom code to do that. Yeah, that's not what these hooks are for. Okay. But we'll get the off-thread PR, which is a breaking change sometime soon. Now the kid's not sick. Mhm.
The not sick kid thing, but also yay for the.
Sure.
All right, so I'm just writing in the agenda in the notes document, the Google Doc. So next steps, Mael writes the design doc for file system hooks. If you could submit that as a PR to the loaders repo, just look at the other
New
design
PR
docs as,
or
I'm
the
sorry?
one I already opened? A new PR or the one I already opened?
A new PR with just the design doc, like a markdown file in the, here, let me find an example. So, if you look at this file, so that was added as a PR against the loaders repo. So just add a new file, somewhere appropriate, another markdown file in this repo and submit it as a PR and make it similar to the ones you see there where it's like, this is the API signature of the hooks and this is like some examples of how to use them. And then we can like nail down what this API should be by iterating on that PR. And then once that's landed in here, then that's like, okay, this is like, we have consensus that this is what we want to build. And then it's like, then your PR implementing it can just be about like the implementation details and not about like the design of it. You know what I mean? Because like that's bitten us in the past where like someone tries to do them both together in a PR against Node, like like with code, and it's just becomes unmanageable because you have like hundreds of comments on the PR thread and you can't get any work done. So yeah, if that works for you, so that'll be the next step for the file system one, and then the other. So, but I'm putting down here the next. Before file system hooks land, 2 other PRs need to precede it. And that's chaining loaders and moving loaders off thread. Is that okay with everyone?
I don't think we need the moving loaders off thread technically, but it would be a nice to have.
Are there any possible complications to the FS hooks that would be more apparent if we had stuff off of, like, basically, are there any monsters under the bed that moving stuff off thread would reveal or make harder to
in
miss?
C++, they're already off thread. JavaScript wise, if people are mucking around with FS and we're putting this as generic FS hooks rather than scope to loading, I know the old NPM crew still is mucking around with FS for their runtime. It's probably going to break in Tropic. I don't know anybody using that or Tink anymore, though. So it's
What is
probably okay.
Tropic?
And Tropic and Tink were efforts by people who used to be employed at NPM to
Make their own version of plug and play.
make their own version of Node, basically, is what it came down to. It did a lot. So they were modifying Node at runtime and like completely overhauling various things that they were upset with, and they never took off. But those will probably break when we do it.
I mean, like ultimately, I think where we'd ultimately like to get is a place where no one should want to, or probably even be able to, monkey patch Node built-in modules like FS. And we want to, I mean, required.extensions has been deprecated for like 8 years. So it would be nice to like actually get rid of that too. And like you're saying, like have loaders just be the way to do this, like and apply to CommonJS as well. And then it's like all of the things that people were using required extensions for, that were monkey patching FS for, are just handled through this like approved blessed API that's not a monkey patch.
Something that would be nice though, it would be not to break those existing use cases before there is a replacement that is ready to be used.
Oh yeah.
Well, of course.
I don't think
I mean,
we'll
that's why we're
get rid of them.
Unfortunately, I think we can build it
So
like
we have
such
some
that we
old
can.
slideshows on it. Basically, the off thread will call back into the main thread for require.extensions and stuff, like to keep compatibility. So if a loader doesn't call the default resolve when a common JS request comes in, that's when it wouldn't go back to the main thread and you break compatibility. But there is a path that was designed for allowing it.
All right, but getting back to what I was writing, okay, maybe the off thread doesn't need to happen before the file system hooks, but it sounds like it will anyway, just because it's closer to being finished and we have to go through a design phase for file system. So either way, the same result in the end.
Sure.
How much time do you have in the next few weeks, Mail?
To make the
like, are you working on this like for your job or?
No, I'm doing that on the side. But
Okay.
that's something I really want to see come to life, so I can't put time aside.
Okay. Because the other thing I was gonna say is like, here, I'll put this as like, I'll just put loaders off thread, that it could possibly go after file system hooks. If we finish the whole design process quickly, but then chaining still isn't landed yet, Jacob is deep in HTTPS imports, so you two might want to talk and see if like, if you're in a hurry to get file system done, maybe you could help with the chaining and get that out the door, so that the prerequisite for file system is done. If you have enough time. So
Okay.
I think the HTTPS imports thing is nearly done. I'm fixing up the last few test cases, or fixing up the things that are not working, and the test cases are proving that they're not working. But I think that should be ready soon.
there's still Mateo's block on it. Has anyone talked to him recently?
I
He's
have
fine.
not.
He just needs to be poked right after we get everything out of draft status. He didn't want to re-review until then.
Okay.
Basically,
But he doesn't have any philosophical objections. Like he just doesn't want to re-review it until it's ready.
Philosophical objections to unflagging it right now, but flagged.
Well, that's fine. Whatever. Okay. Well, great. So then I still wouldn't assume that PR had like 15 reviewers on it, so I wouldn't assume that that's just gonna like sail in. So once you're done,
no, sorry, I meant it'll be ready for review.
Right, but I'm just saying, like, I have a feeling review on that, like my PR that just fixed a bunch of tests took like 3 weeks to review. So like I have a feeling this could take a long time to review this PR. So that could occupy you for a while. But hopefully that like a lot of that time will just be like waiting on people to get back to you. So maybe if you have time, you can get started on chaining while you're like waiting on crap from the HTTPS PR. I don't know.
I think I can't, because I'll need things that are coming from like some changes that are in. I guess I could copy them over.
Or split them out into a smaller MR. Parking
yeah.
lot. Okay. Well, anyway, we can play this by ear and talk on Slack and stuff. Loader chaining. Well, anything else about that, or should we go to the other topic? But we have a few minutes left.
I mean, loader chaining, I'm gonna just poke the bear and be like, we should stop sending things in as parameters, but I've been doing that. So
Are there any that we need to
Uh,
wait before we move on? Mail, did you get everything from us that you needed for your get? Okay, cool. Bradley, what do you want to remove or not add as
Are
parameters?
you talking
want-
about like changing the signature of the hooks?
yeah. I'm fine
So just make a
leaving the
PR against the
signature,
design doc.
honestly. Just
Make a PR against the design doc with what you want the signatures to be, and we can discuss it.
so I'm fine leaving the signatures as they are for now for back compat reasons and just adding a reference to next. But we can do that as an additive change after. So
Well, there already is a reference to that. I mean, the idea was to
No, there's
replace
only
the
a
default
reference
resolve
to-
with next.
there's only a reference to next of the same hook type.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think
And
they
I mean,
should
we could
call-
add other types
Oh.
of references later too. Like that's
yeah, but it'll be breaking most likely. So
well, yeah.
Like you would want to change the third argument from being
I don't
just a
want a
reference
third
to the
argument.
function.
I don't want a third argument. I
Oh,
want a
where would it
reference to the
go?
whole loader. Like, and I don't want to have to be like require yarn loader or import yarn loader. I want just like a reference to the actual next loader, all of it.
But where is that coming from? If it's not an
I mean,
argument, is
you
it
could put it on
this or
import
something?
meta. You could put it wherever. Import meta is a great place to put it, actually.
Okay.
All right. Well, anyway, that seems like a beside the point. Like you can make
Yeah,
that
it's
change
not.
whenever.
We can do that later. That was.
We
just-
can add chaining right now and it not being a break change. You could follow. I would do the offset thing first because that seems more important. But then I think once chaining is done, it makes more sense to add this like other references to other loaders stuff once chaining is implemented. So you have other loaders to reference.
Sure.
So we can land chaining and then you can land this like
No.
API refactor.
Sure.
Cool.
Okay. So loaders, loading while loading loaders. Is
That's
this really
not an easy
doable?
one, but I think it's bound to happen that someone will want to make dash loaders TS node dash loaders something else that is written with that TS node. Or
Sorry, what?
with yarn, it will happen that you will want to reference the loader.
Who wants
you want to-
re-entrance?
Yes, loader.
That's what?
Re-entrancy. So if you have TS node, for example, and it's loaded in a system that has yarn loader involved, TS node could come out of yarn's memory, for example, rather than disk. So that would require TS node, the loader, to be instrumented by the yarn loader.
Could this be achieved with that import meta thing that we were talking about earlier? Like you
I
just
mean, no.
hop on in there?
No, because you've got to get the source of the TS loader out of yarn.
Oh,
I think
you
we
mean
need
like
to implement
TS loader
all this-
itself is coming from yarn's virtual yada yada yada. Oh my
And, like,
god.
I
Okay.
just don't want to support this use case, period. Like,
Okay.
Yeah, but that's something that people will want. Otherwise, they will be impossible to have loaders from packages.
Why?
No, you just
How
have to
would
bundle
they-
it all into a single loader. Like, you can't do it over multiple hyphen loaders, which I think is fine.
But if we have to bundle them into a single loader, then the chaining API doesn't matter because package managers will have to
Yeah.
bundle them into a
I
single
think
one.
this is an extremely rare use case, personally.
Is it? Why? Like I would
Because, like, it does all sorts of weird stuff to have re-entrancy. Like, This is why the specs for JavaScript to HTML like avoid reentrancy like it's the devil. Like it is really hard to reason about your data model if your data model becomes cyclic.
But it's not cyclic though.
It would become cyclic unless you have like, because now you have like bidirectional. So data comes in from the import site, goes through TS node, goes through yarn, but yarn can also have instrumented backwards and overridden what TS node is.
No,
So that's why it
it's-
becomes cyclic.
Yarn knows what is the next loader because it's passed to it during when the hooks are called, right?
It only knows that it can call the functions of the next loader. It doesn't have like a file name. It doesn't have.
Yeah, it doesn't know what it is.
But so what it can do is that first we load the PNP hook, then we call it with TS node, and as next we pass it the built-in node final result loader.
So you only get one next. You don't get access to the default.
No, because the
Hold on for a
last one is
second.
the default.
Hold on for a second. Loaders are URLs, right? So they can be
Loaders are instances, like they're not a URL.
No, I mean when you pass
But
dash
they're-
dash loader on the command line, it's a URL.
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
could be a data URI, right?
Yes, this was explicitly the case because in order to deal with people who wanted to be able to load purely off the command line without a file for a loader, we could have introduced like a multitude of flags, or we could have supported data URIs. And
So,
we went with
let me
that.
ask you this, Mael. If you wanted to implement this, say you had plug and play as a global, like plug and play itself has to be on disk, right? So it's like npm install -g plug and play or something along those lines, right? So then you could have like PMP or whatever the, binary is, PMP -- loader TS node -- loader or something else, entry.js or whatever. Plug and play could parse the command line arguments, convert that -- loader TS node into -- loader data URI of the contents of the TS node loader. And then like run node like that.
I don't think that would work in practice for our users. It seems far too complicated. And maybe not complicated, it's not that complicated to parse the command line. It's mostly that there are edge cases that we are not going to think about. For example, what if you're sending -- loader, I don't know, through to another process that you're forwarding the arguments. Proxying and making mutation at this level, I think, is bound to fail at some point.
But it's at least a workaround that does get you what you want, of like loading the contents of the TS node loader from plug and play's memory cache instead of the disk, the file that doesn't exist.
I'd
right?
also be wary of things. So the way that loaders were designed is loaders, their input and their output is serializable. It would be good to understand like the effect of loaders being reentrant, what that means for that, because.
But I still don't think it's the solution would be reentrant. First, the PNP loader is evaluated, then it's called to resolve TS node, then it returns, and then node keeps going by then calling PNP with a different next this time, because for the first time the next is the default loader, the second time the next is TS node, in order to resolve the entry point. So it will not be reentrant. PMP will not call TS node, and TS node would. I mean, I'm not.
How would you even specify this?
I mean, you just have your loaders start blocking, waiting for other loaders, and then you don't start loading any loader until the previous loader is completed.
Yeah.
And so this also brings like a bunch of other questions I have about fan out and fan in, because it means things aren't really reusable. So one of the things that already exists is loader chains are not the same across worker threads. One worker thread could have TS node installed, one could have CoffeeScript installed. I mean, and so in this case, if they instrument each other, you can't reuse a loader chain across stuff. Right now, they don't instrument each other, so your loader chain isn't dependent on the other loaders in your chain. This would make, if you have 3 loaders, A, B, C, in order to reuse it, the other worker thread has to have loaders A, B, C. Like, it can't reuse AB if that's the chain in the worker thread. It can't reuse BC if that's the chain in the thread. Like, this is a complicated issue.
I'm not sure I understand the reusability thing.
Sure, right now, I could spin up a loader as a, service process and just leave it there effectively for Node, because it's not instrumented anywhere. You can't like muck around with it really from another loader. So if TS node has a language server, which it spins up as a service process, which it does currently in TSC, the command line, it'll spin up a background process to handle stuff and keep it warm and cached and everything. We can do that right now, and it's not really a problem. If you do that when, let's say, Yarn instruments TSC, you can't use just TSC's normal background, for example, because Yarn's done something to it. You're not sure what. So you have to have the TSC that was instrumented by Yarn. Because like file system ops are different in that form of TSC. So like you can't have a background worker that just stays alive. You have to like spin up a full new chain. And so instead of like a browser example, there's shared workers, shared web workers.
Hmm.
Right now, you can have shared web workers go and talk to each other just fine. They're isolated enough that like you can do what you want with them basically and have them able to talk to each other. But if a shared web worker were to instrument another shared web worker, then you can't do that. They're no longer isolated enough, and now you have to spin up bundles of shared web workers.
But I don't see how Yarn would instrument TS node. It's just that the TS node string would go through the resolver of Yarn in order to, know where to obtain it from. But it would still be the same model in the end.
No,
Not
because you
necessarily.
modified the file system on that one. So I don't know what is safe to do.
What?
So like Yarn TSC versus normal TSC. Let's say Yarn TSC is the TSC that is booted up through Yarn's in-memory, whatever, virtual files.
Yeah.
This does not have the exact same behavior as a normal TSC because it is able to read files out of memory.
Yeah.
And that is the problem. They do not behave the same. So you have to spin up only a Yarn TSC if there is. So even if you have an existing TSC.
But what you're saying is that the normal TSC doesn't exist because you cannot load it because it's not on disk.
Yep, but you're not guaranteed that yarn is in all of the loader chains. Anyway,
You are, because otherwise the dependencies will not be able to load.
that's not true currently in Node. Like you can change -- loader when you spin up a worker.
But if you have a loader that is tasked from telling the rest of the loaders where to find their dependencies, if you remove this loader, then necessarily the other ones will not work.
No, they're fine. So if I had TSC and CoffeeScript, two different loaders, they don't need to talk to each other. I can spin up a worker thread with both TSC and CoffeeScript.
Mhm.
Then I could spin up a different worker with just CoffeeScript. If they're isolated, the CoffeeScript loader can have a single instance shared between both. So like, I could spin up one thread for all the CoffeeScript loaders in your entire app.
Yes, but in that case, it would be the same thing, except that in one instance, you would have PNP, CoffeeScript, and what's the other one you said? CoffeeScript and TypeScript. And in another thread, you could have just PNP and CoffeeScript, but not. Basically,
So
PNP would be
Guys, I'm gonna make Bradley the host because I need to
Sure.
get going. I assume that some other team is coming any minute because
Yep.
there's another meeting on the schedule at noon. But until they show up,
Sure. So even if
Gotcha.
you do that, like if you have TSC, yarn, PNP, and then you have TSC, PNP, you can't share the TSC because it has been instrumented by CoffeeScript. So TSC, CoffeeScript, yarn cannot reuse anything except maybe the yarn PNP.
Because you're saying
between
that
those
maybe
two.
CoffeeScript has mutated the environment in which TypeScript is executing. Is that that?
It has instrumented the other loaders. So yes, it is no longer safe for you to muck
Oh
around
my God, I
with it.
finally get it. Sorry.
So you could probably
basically it's
reuse
like
yarn.
creating a world and something about the world is different, but it doesn't know what it is.
Yeah, and I don't know how we would statically know what's different.
So I think I understand what you mean. But we already do that. For example, in Yarn, we already have the -- required PNP, -- required TS node pattern that has to be followed. And it's already been used with a fair amount of success. Of course, we have to monkey patch things because there isn't the primitives that we need. But overall, it seems to work.
Kind of. So the problem here is like, in the case that you do that, you spin up a new TSC and a new yarn PNP in every worker thread that you do this. With -- require.
Yes.
Like we are facing pushback on just having like loaders from people. Like there's issues, in particular memory usage of doing so.
Mm-hmm. So basically you would want to have loaders instantiated only once and then reused across all the workers.
Usually there are different scenarios where that's not always the case. Maybe you want to spin up 2 instances of Babel because it's CPU heavy and not differentiate them. And stuff like that. But the moment that they can instrument each other, I'm unclear. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm unclear on like how we're going to maintain such a workflow because you've now made them dependent on each other. So another example is startup time is a big problem. If you're requiring every loader to finish loading before you start loading the next loader. I mean, you really want really fast to load loaders at that point. So you're going to want to avoid static imports. Like, you're going to want to await like something, or just start loading it with dynamic import in the front, because it's going to be bad otherwise for startup time. And so it's a lot to think about, and I don't want to support it. Like, the use case that it gives is basically any loader is determined entirely. There is no such thing as any of the other loaders, basically. Only the first loader matters, because it can intercept and destroy or replace or mock or whatever any of the subsequent loaders. Your CLI doesn't matter what you passed in. Only the last loader is your security model.
The problem, I think, is that it will really go against expectations. When you register a loader, you really expect it to affect the follow-up loaders.
That's not how a bunch of these instrumentations work in other scenarios, in other environments.
Like you're saying, if you have Babel and TypeScript and something, you're expecting Babel to be able to manipulate the TypeScript loader? I wouldn't really expect that. I would expect them to be independent.
You mean me, Jakob?
Yeah, sorry.
Yes, but for the use case, for example, of Node-loader HTTP PNP-loader TS node, I would expect the PNP loader to be taken into account when I'm loading the other loaders that will be loaded this time from my dependencies. If I had, for example, an HTTP loader which loads things from the network, then I would expect my HTTP loader to be applied when I'm then using -- loader with loaders obtained from HTTP sources.
They already do that.
Yes,
without
but only if it like opts into doing so. Like the HTTPS loader, let's say that wasn't in Node, like that loader would be responsible for deciding whether it does something.
Also, there's a difference in capabilities and security concerns here. Manipulating how an app works versus manipulating how like actual loading works is something that's complicated. Like, when you can't make any static guarantees about what a loader does. So like, I write a top level loader and I just prevent all other loaders from functioning. Like, that's a valid use case under this model. I can basically be like, I want to like ignore what's on the command line arguments and stuff like that.
Well, couldn't that already happen now with chaining? Because
it is always loaded. It's always loaded right now. So you can short circuit, which is a little bit different. Here you're basically saying there's nothing on the command line. No loader can protect itself because they're all under control of the other loaders.
But it's just the other way around. If you want to really monitor the models that are evaluated within a process, then you can create a loader that would also know what are the other loaders that are imported. If they are,
you can know what they are, but you can't manipulate their behavior.
Sorry?
You can know what they are, but you can't manipulate their behavior.
Well,
so you couldn't like disable a security feature in one of the loaders. You just have to not call that loader.
Yeah, if you could do something like that, that sounds like it would be bad. Well, obviously,
Well,
disabling a security feature out from under somebody is inherently bad. But like if they are basically pulling the rug out from under you in any way, that sounds like it would be not a good thing.
yeah, but there's like, it's just a lot to think about. It's not necessarily like a fatal or blocking issue, but it just needs a lot of write-up on why this is a good idea. Because conventional behavior in other environments is this is a bad idea. Like, it's hard to reason about is really why it's a bad idea.
If there is with this, I'm not sure how people will be expected to use loaders with PNP. To use third-party loaders.
The question is, do you need all the hooks or do you just need the file hook? Or like, what do you need to enable your use case with PNP? Do you need all loaders to be able to do this? Does a loader have to manually say they need this behavior? Like, there's all sorts of things that you can work around. Like PNP could set some variable somewhere and it'd be like, I'm a loader, but I'm about to hijack all the other loaders.
But since they are loaded in parallel, it wouldn't work.
Well, it wouldn't be allowed to load in parallel. It would just need to check each one before it starts. It wouldn't need to wait for the full load. It would just be like, oh, this loader's trying to do something. We need to not load in parallel. Like, there are workarounds to this that are much easier for me to comprehend with my small brain.
I was gonna say,
So
you
if
broke my
Yarn
brain.
is like, I need to instrument the loaders, that's one thing. But saying all loaders need to instrument all other loaders is hard.
So you
to
would
think
like to, so you would like it to be the exception rather than the rule.
To my knowledge, it must be the exception because there are a lot of concerns with it being the default.
So the question would be how to figure out a good API to have these exceptions.
I mean, it could just be you have an export name.
But these exports,
or it could be like in that loader's package.json, which isn't going to work for HTTPS, but that's okay.
would it work if it was a different flag?
Sure, that's fine.
So we could have something like ambient loaders.
Sure.
That are loaded before everything else, in sequentially, and then everything else.
That's fine.
What happened? Like, are we going to run into an ambient loader that needs to play God to other ambient loaders?
Well, that's the point. These are the things that play God to the other loaders.
No, but I'm saying like an inception type model of like an ambient loader.
No, because with composition, at least, like the top level, the last ambient loader is the ambient loader.
Okay.
So like every time you do it, you're just adding another ambient on the end, basically.
Okay.
And I mean, that's fine. Like Node won't be able to do any tricks to save memory or CPU with these things, which is fine.
And so for things like workers, Node would know that it would always have to set up those ambient workers. And then it would be able to split the regular loaders, as you mentioned.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
But like, there have been several companies that started moving to worker threads, Babbel's moving to worker threads, all these things. And just the CPU and memory, the memory usage goes up a lot if you don't reuse your worker. So you can easily break a gig on accident doing it of memory usage.
Okay.
So the most ambient loader we could probably reuse, but all the other ones you couldn't.
I guess that's also something that we are going to have to figure out on Yarn's side to avoid consuming all the data.
As long
Question.
as the ambient loaders are the exact same, you could probably reuse the chain. It just needs to be written up.
Are
So, yeah.
are we possibly going to run into some kind of stateful situation within the ambient loaders where, like, let's say you've got 5 threads and your ambient loader over here is behaving differently than the other ambient loaders. So then the thing, let's say, I don't know, just a regular loader A has gone through ambient loader 1, or which is in worker thread 1, then it's non-deterministic and is different than if it had gone through worker 2.
Yes. Any ambient loader basically removes all optimization. Just one prevents the hyphen loaders from being parallelized.
No, what I'm wondering
For
is,
sure.
would you have a different output than if it came from 1 versus 2?
Probably, potentially, depends. I don't know.
If that's true, then I think we can't allow that, because
Well,
then it's
it's
like,
up to the ambient loader. It's whatever the ambient loader said it could do. Like you could load with, in Electron's case, like you could load where one worker is using one ASR file and the other is using a different ASR file, however they're pronounced. And so
Mhm.
they'd inherently have different file system operations.
but then you just have insanity.
Eh, it's fine. I mean, as long as the people who wrote these ambient loaders know like how complicated it is, sure.
Okay.
Like hyphen loader is mostly safe-ish. That's why it's easier to optimize and reuse stuff. These just would be like, whatever you do, you need to do it instead of Node. Because Node can't do any of the optimizations. All the optimization would be up to these ambient loaders to manually do, because Node doesn't know what's going on.
Okay.
I'm sure people can figure out how to optimize it somewhat.
So I can make a design doc as well for that.
Yes,
Sure.
please.
And
Like if you want it. Otherwise, I might not understand what we want to do.
So basically we have the separate module map right now. Instead of having a separate module map that's shared, we wouldn't do any of that. We would basically spin up a user land application for a loader. That's the difference. Right now, we have a separate module map just for the loaders, and then a separate module map for the user code.
Mhm.
In this case, these loaders basically treat other loaders instead of having a loader module map. The loaders under these ambient loaders are treated as user code for the other loader, for the ambient loader.
Oh, yeah, gotcha.
So it shouldn't be too bad. It's just kind of need to know the specifics on what it does. Okay, I should get going.
Okay.
I'm a little over.
we'll need to
Yeah. Okay.